Hello, this week I'll be with Deborah Zafman, who's a volunteer with immigrants. Deborah, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I live in Montclair since 2010, and I'm half Ecuadorian, so I grew up bilingual thanks to my abuelita, my grandmother, and that was in Los Angeles. So I was always fond of speaking in Spanish, and I can tell you about how I got involved with the Montclair Sanctuary Alliance, if you like.
Yeah.
So my synagogue had an apartment above the Hebrew school. It's called Red Gables. It's this beautiful brick building on South Fullerton. And we had this big discussion about whether or not we should use that apartment to provide sanctuary for undocumented immigrants. And the original idea was to actually house someone who was at risk of being deported. Literally, like the police were after them. Yeah. And this idea that if they're in a house of worship, whether it's a church or a synagogue, the police cannot come get them. And that was the idea. And it was kind of, my synagogue is B'nai Keshet, and it's very connected to social activism and human rights. And so we had this big meeting, should we or shouldn't we allow this apartment to be used in this way? And it was kind of a resounding yes, of course. And I was interested because I thought, oh, well, I'd be able to communicate if they don't speak English, and I can use my Spanish, in this case. And then what ended up happening is there weren't any cases that came up. And someone from the area had heard about our apartment being available, and this family from Honduras arrived in Texas on the border, and they were staying at a church. And they had a really special case because they had a daughter who was blind, a son who was deaf, and then an infant baby. And this was, I think, 2019. And they were staying at this church, and I guess the priest from that church knew someone from the East Coast and said, oh, I have this family, we are trying to help them. They don't have any place to go, they don't have contacts here. And he said, oh, as a matter of fact, I know about this synagogue in Montclair, New Jersey that has this apartment. Let's try to connect you. And that's how it happened that they arrived. And I had already put my name on a list first it was like donating things for the apartment, furniture and all the things so that the apartment was ready if we got someone to be in there. And so I distinctly recall meeting the family literally the day they got here. And I kind of fell in love with them because I think there was just like my heart opened, and they were young. I think at the time the parents were probably 26 or 27. And they had these 3 children, and that's sort of where it all started. And then suddenly I got so involved with them that I was doing kind of everything to help them, driving them everywhere. There's a great medical clinic called Zufall in West Orange that helps give medical care. I don't even think they were paying a minimum. It was all just given all this care. And so I would drive them constantly to appointments, drive them to the market. What ended up happening from my end was I realized how generous and beautiful a place Montclair is, because through helping them, my world opened up to all these organizations that want to help people in need. And I discovered Tony's Kitchen, I discovered the Human Needs Food Pantry, I discovered the government subsidies that give, I guess it's kind of like food stamps, but it was more for the baby, to get like diapers and milk. And I was just overwhelmed with how much generosity there seemed to be in Montclair. And the other thing I noticed is whenever I was with the mom and maybe with her blind daughter, I would tell the story like they came from Honduras, literally with the husband came.
So how did you get started and involved in the whole immigration process?
Well, my synagogue had this apartment, and I immediately wanted to volunteer because I was bilingual and I love speaking Spanish, and also because I lived abroad. I lived in different countries. I knew what it was like to be a foreigner in a strange land and not have family or support or friends, literally just arriving and not knowing a soul. And so having had that experience in different countries, I felt like I was well equipped to have more empathy or compassion for their situation. So when the synagogue decided to create this alliance of other churches and synagogues to help asylum-seeking immigrants and house them in this apartment. It just seemed like a natural fit that I should be involved, volunteering, particularly because I could communicate with them, and I wanted to make them feel really welcome and tell them I understood where they were coming from, given that I had been in foreign countries as well, not knowing anybody. So I wanted them to feel safe and secure.
So earlier this week I heard about an 8-year-old girl who passed away in the U.S. Customs custody, and this gets me thinking about all the stories about kids of immigrant parents who don't have a choice whether they want to get in this situation or not. So how do you feel how do children adjust from your experience? How do you think they adjust?
Well, I actually think it might be better to be a child when you immigrate, because I think in general children are way more adaptable, and because they have less sort of references to maybe what's good or bad, what's comfortable, what's poverty, I think they can just flow with it much better, and they're more kind of accepting of circumstances, just whatever is. Because often you'll hear people who say they grew up really poor when they were a kid. They didn't know they were poor. They just they accept the life they have. So I think in a lot of ways it's ideal to be a kid when you're making this big change. And I also imagine that life in Central America can be so dangerous and so hard that a child at some level understands the parents' desire to make this journey that's very risky to make it across the border, and maybe they even can experience it in a less traumatic way because they're a child. I think it's different if it's children who are sent on their own, just with a coyote. I think that might be very different. But if you're going with your family, I think it's probably better to be a child.
So I know that you recently visited Ecuador, in the Montaña de Luz, where the summer camps held, where the kids learn English. So how do you think the program kind of affects and correlates with kids in the immigration system?
Well, I think that it's really wonderful that these kids are going to get to learn English because of how it might open doors in their minds and also for opportunities in their life, because English is kind of this language that everyone around the world seems to think is the language one ought to know for opportunities. And maybe they would also have ideas of being able to spend time in the United States because they've been exposed to this other culture through the language and maybe through other experiences. And so as far as how it connects to immigration, I suppose their exposure in Montaña de Luz to English and other, let's say, American culture could have them be more equipped to either decide maybe when they're a little older, I want to go on a program to the United States and see what life is like there, and then maybe ultimately immigrate in a way that's maybe less dangerous and more legal than maybe the Honduran families I've spoken about.
So do you have any suggestions for the camp, or anything you want to say about it?
Well, I think it's awesome, and I think it's wonderful that you get to be in that special place teaching them English. And I think the only thing I would say, coming from the art world and believing very strongly in creative expression and the power of aesthetic experience and being around art in all forms and nature, of course, to enhance their experience beyond just, let's say, grammar and learning the language, to having more maybe doing poetry, writing more freely using English and not feeling confined by grammar rules, and just allowing them to have an experience that's maybe more liberating. So that would be my only suggestion.
Yeah, we'll work on it. We have some stuff, we have an arts and crafts period and periods for them.